It was past midnight. The highway was empty, stretching into the dark like a road that had forgotten where it ended. A taxi driver, exhausted from a long shift, was on his final ride home. Then, through the fog, he saw something, small, white, and motionless, standing by the roadside. He slowed down, squinting through the windshield. At first, he thought it was a person, but as his headlights lit the figure, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a woman. It was a statue of the Virgin Mary, standing perfectly still in the middle of nowhere, her face calm, her eyes lowered as if in prayer. He stepped out of the car, shivering in the cold air. "Who put this here?" he whispered. No one answered, only silence and the hum of the engine behind him. Something inside him told him to take her, protect her, bring her somewhere safe. So he did. But that night, everything changed. The radio began to flicker. The city lights went out one by one, and by dawn, the entire town would know his name. Stay with me until the end, because this story will touch your heart in ways you never imagined. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. Roberto Martinez had been driving taxis for 17 years. 17 years of watching the city breathe through his windshield, the morning commuters rushing to catch trains, the late-night party crowd stumbling into his back seat, the hospital visits that carried more tears than words. He'd seen everything, or at least he thought he had. That Tuesday night started like any other. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio, sending him from one corner of the city to another. Pick up at 5th and Main. Drop off at the airport. Another fare downtown. His hands moved automatically on the steering wheel, muscle memory guiding him through streets he could navigate with his eyes closed. Roberto wasn't particularly religious. He'd grown up Catholic, sure. His grandmother had dragged him to Sunday Mass when he was young, her weathered fingers clutching rosary beads that clicked softly in the pew beside him. But life had a way of wearing down those childhood beliefs. Too many nights picking up broken people. Too many stories that ended without happy endings. Faith felt like a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. His wife Maria still believed. She kept a small shrine in their kitchen, candles flickering beneath faded photographs of saints whose names Roberto had forgotten. Sometimes he'd catch her whispering prayers over the morning coffee, her lips moving silently as steam rose from her cup. He never interrupted those moments. Everyone needed something to hold on to. The last call of the night came at 11:47, an elderly woman needing a ride home from the hospital. Her son had been in surgery, she explained through the partition, her voice thin with exhaustion. The operation went well, but visiting hours were over. She pressed a crumpled 20 into his hand when he dropped her off, telling him to keep the change even though the fare was only $12. "God bless you," she whispered before closing the door. Roberto sat in the empty hospital parking lot for a moment, watching her disappear through the automatic doors. The 20 felt heavy in his palm. He thought about Maria waiting at home, probably asleep on the couch with the television still glowing. She always waited up when she could. Even after all these years, he should have gone straight home, should have taken the direct route through downtown, past the closed shops and empty sidewalks. Instead, something pulled him toward Highway 9, the long stretch of asphalt that curved around the edge of town like a sleeping snake. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was the way moonlight painted the road silver. Or maybe it was something else entirely. The highway was deserted at that hour. No truckers making their midnight runs. No teenagers racing their father's cars. Just Roberto and the yellow lines disappearing beneath his headlights. The radio played softly, an old song his mother used to hum while cooking dinner. He found himself tapping the steering wheel to the rhythm, thinking about Sunday dinners and the smell of fresh tortillas. That's when the fog rolled in. It came from nowhere, thick and white like cotton pulled apart by invisible hands. Roberto slowed down, his grip tightening on the wheel. He'd driven through fog before, but this felt different, heavier somehow. the kind of fog that seemed to muffle not just sound, but time itself. His headlights struggled to cut through the wall of white. The road markers became suggestions rather than certainties. He considered pulling over, waiting for it to clear, but something urged him forward, a feeling he couldn't name, like being called by a voice he couldn't quite hear. Mile marker 43 came and went, barely visible through the mist. Then 44. Roberto had driven this stretch of highway countless times, but tonight it felt foreign, as if the fog had transported him to some other road in some other world. That's when he saw her. At first, just a shape emerging from the white, small and still, standing exactly where no one should be standing. Roberto's foot found the brake, the taxi slowing to a crawl. His heart began to pound, not from fear, but from something deeper, recognition without understanding. As his headlights touched the figure, the fog seemed to part slightly, as if showing him something he was meant to see. The statue stood no more than 3 feet tall, carved from white marble that seemed to glow in the artificial light. Her robes flowed in perfect folds, her hands pressed together in prayer, her face tilted downward with an expression of infinite peace. The Virgin Mary. Roberto recognized her instantly, even though he hadn't thought about her in years. Every detail was perfect, from the delicate features of her face to the tiny rosette carved into the hem of her gown. She looked exactly like the statue that had stood in his grandmother's garden, the one he used to climb on as a child, until his grandmother scolded him for treating the Holy Mother like playground equipment. But what was she doing here, in the middle of nowhere, on a highway that led to nothing but farmland and forgotten towns? Roberto pulled the taxi to the shoulder, hazard lights blinking red against the fog. He sat for a moment, engine idling, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The statue didn't move, of course. Statues don't move. But something about her presence felt alive, as if she were waiting for him. Roberto had picked up his share of unusual things over the years. Forgotten groceries left on bus benches, lost dogs wandering busy intersections. Once, a wedding dress hanging from a tree branch, after what was obviously a very bad day for some bride. But a religious statue on a deserted highway, that was a first. He opened the door and stepped into the cold night air. The fog swirled around his ankles, damp and somehow warm despite the chill. His footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound were being absorbed by something invisible. The statue was even more beautiful up close, the marble smooth and unblemished, despite being outside in the elements. "How did you get here?" Roberto whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the taxi's engine. No answer, of course, just the statue's serene expression, her downcast eyes that seemed to be looking at something beyond the physical world. Roberto circled her slowly, looking for any clue about how she'd ended up in this impossible place. No tire tracks in the soft earth beside the highway, no footprints, no signs of human activity at all. It was as if she had simply appeared. Roberto reached out tentatively, his fingers brushing against the cool marble. The moment he touched her, something shifted. The fog seemed to pulse with a light that had no source. The air grew warmer, and somewhere, so faint he might have imagined it, he heard music, soft and distant, like a lullaby sung by someone who loved you more than words could express. He knew he had to take her. The thought came from somewhere deeper than logic, deeper than the practical voice that usually guided his decisions. This statue didn't belong on the highway. She belonged somewhere safe, somewhere she would be cared for and protected. Roberto was a strong man, built solid from years of loading luggage and helping elderly passengers. But as he lifted the statue, he was surprised by how light she felt. Not weightless, but perfectly balanced, as if she wanted to be carried. He cradled her carefully against his chest, her marble face pressed against his jacket. The walk back to the taxi felt longer than it should have. The fog seemed to shift around them, sometimes thick enough to hide his own hands, sometimes thin enough to reveal stars he was certain hadn't been visible moments before. By the time he reached the car, Roberto's heart was pounding not from exertion, but from anticipation. Something was beginning, though he didn't know what. He settled the statue gently in the passenger seat, adjusting the seatbelt around her small frame. It felt ridiculous and necessary at the same time. She sat perfectly upright, her hands still pressed together in prayer, her expression unchanged. But somehow, Roberto felt less alone than he had in years. The drive home should have taken 20 minutes. Roberto knew every turn, every traffic light, every pothole between the highway and his neighborhood. But as soon as he pulled back onto the road, everything changed. The fog began to lift, but not in any natural way. It peeled back in layers, like curtains being drawn by invisible hands. And as it cleared, Roberto saw that the city below was different. The streetlights that usually dotted the landscape like fallen stars were flickering. Not the random flicker of old bulbs or power surges, but a rhythm, a pattern that seemed almost like breathing. Roberto pulled over to the side of the road, his hands trembling as he gripped the steering wheel. The city spread below him like a circuit board, but something was wrong with the electricity. The lights weren't just flickering randomly, they were pulsing in waves, moving from building to building in a pattern that made his chest tight with wonder. He glanced at the statue beside him. Her marble face remained peaceful, unchanged, but the air inside the taxi had grown thick with something he couldn't name. Not fear, something closer to awe. The radio, which had been playing soft music moments before, began to crackle with static. Then, through the white noise, Roberto heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable, speaking in Spanish the same words his grandmother used to whisper over her evening prayers. Ave Maria, llena eres de gracia. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It simply was, flowing through the speakers like water through cupped hands. Roberto's breath caught. He reached for the radio dial, but before his fingers could touch it, the voice faded. The static cleared, and in the sudden silence, he heard something else. Car horns, distant but growing closer. The sound of engines starting, of doors slamming, of people calling to each other across the darkness. The entire city was waking up. He pressed the accelerator, the taxi winding down the hill toward the valley below. As he drove, Roberto watched the impossible unfold through his windshield. Every streetlight they passed flickered to life at the exact moment his headlights touched it. Traffic signals changed from red to green as he approached, creating a clear path through intersections that should have been controlled by timers. But it was the people that made him truly understand something extraordinary was happening. They emerged from apartment, buildings and houses, drawn to their windows and doorsteps by something they couldn't explain. Some held candles, others clutched rosaries. Many simply stood in their doorways, looking up at the sky with expressions Roberto recognized from his childhood. The same look his grandmother wore during midnight mass on Christmas Eve, the look of people witnessing something holy. As Roberto turned onto Maple Street, 3 blocks from his own home, he saw Mrs. Patterson from the corner market standing in her front yard. She was crying, her hands pressed to her chest, staring directly at his taxi as it passed. She waved, not at Roberto but at the statue beside him, and whispered something he couldn't hear but somehow understood. More people appeared. Families spilled out of houses. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years stood together on sidewalks, pointing at his taxi with wonder etched on their faces. Children pressed their noses against windows, their eyes wide with the kind of belief that adults spend lifetimes trying to remember. Roberto's phone began to ring, then ring again. The display showed call after call from numbers he recognized. Maria, his brother Carlos, his dispatcher, even his estranged sister Elena, who lived 2 states away and hadn't called him in 3 years. He let them all go to voicemail, unable to trust his voice to form words that could explain what was happening. By the time he reached his street, a small crowd had gathered outside his house. Not a mob, but something gentler. Neighbors holding vigil, children clutching stuffed animals and homemade crosses, elderly women with their hair in curlers and their rosaries in their hands. They parted as his taxi approached, creating a path to his driveway like waves opening for a boat. Roberto parked and sat for a moment, his engine ticking as it cooled. Through the passenger window, he could see Maria standing on their front porch, her hand shading her eyes as she tried to peer through the glass. She wore the blue nightgown he'd bought her for their anniversary, the one she saved for special occasions. Her face carried the same expression he'd seen on everyone else's faces tonight. Not confusion or fear, but recognition, as if she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. Roberto opened his door and stepped out. The crowd fell silent, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of quiet that fills churches during the most sacred moments of Mass, the kind that holds space for miracles. He walked around to the passenger side, his legs unsteady beneath him. Every eye followed his movement, but no one spoke. No one rushed forward. They simply waited, as if they understood that some moments required patience. Roberto opened the passenger door and carefully lifted the statue. She felt even lighter than before, almost as if she were lifting herself. As he cradled her against his chest, a soft gasp rippled through the crowd. Several people dropped to their knees. Others made the sign of the cross. A few began to pray in whispers that sounded like wind through leaves. But it was Maria's reaction that stopped Roberto's heart. His wife, who had spent 17 years watching him grow distant from faith, who had prayed alone in their kitchen while he worked late into the night, took one look at the statue and smiled, not with surprise or confusion, but with the deep satisfaction of someone whose prayers had finally been answered. She walked down the porch steps slowly, her bare feet silent on the concrete. When she reached Roberto, she extended her hands toward the statue, not to take her, but simply to touch her. The moment Maria's fingers brushed the marble, something changed in her face. Years of worry lines softened. The exhaustion she carried from working double shifts at the diner melted away. She looked like the young woman Roberto had married, full of dreams and unshakable faith. "She's beautiful," Maria whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air. Roberto nodded, unable to speak. Together they carried the statue up the walkway toward their house. The crowd followed at a respectful distance, their footsteps creating a soft rhythm on the pavement. As they reached the front door, Roberto realized he didn't know where to put her. His house was small, practical. They didn't have a shrine or a special place for something so sacred. But Maria seemed to know exactly what to do. She led him through the living room, past the couch where she'd waited for him so many nights, past the television that had provided background noise for their quiet dinners. She stopped in front of the kitchen window, the one that looked out onto their small backyard where she grew tomatoes and marigolds. "Here," she said simply. "She can watch over the garden, and the garden can watch over her." Roberto set the statue gently on the windowsill. The moonlight streaming through the glass seemed to gather around her, making the white marble glow with soft radiance. Outside, their neighbors had arranged themselves in their backyard, creating an impromptu vigil. Some brought folding chairs. Others spread blankets on the grass. A few carried thermoses of coffee and homemade cookies, turning the sacred moment into something beautifully human. As Roberto and Maria stood before the statue, watching their community gather in spontaneous celebration, Roberto felt something shift inside his chest. Not a dramatic transformation, but something quieter. Like a door he'd forgotten existed slowly opening. The cynicism that had protected him through years of difficult nights began to soften. The distance he'd maintained from hope started to close. Maria slipped her hand into his, her fingers warm and familiar. "How did you find her?" she asked quietly. Roberto looked at the statue's peaceful face, then out at the people filling their backyard with quiet joy. "I don't think I found her," he said finally. "I think she found me." The radio in the taxi outside began to play again, soft music drifting through the open windows. But this time, Roberto recognized the song. It was the lullaby his grandmother used to sing, the one he'd been humming earlier that evening. The melody wrapped around the house like a blessing, connecting past and present, memory and miracle. And as the first hints of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, Roberto Martinez understood that his life as a simple taxi driver was over. Something far more extraordinary was about to begin. The news crews arrived first. 3 white vans with satellite dishes extended like mechanical prayers toward the cloudy morning sky. Roberto watched them through his kitchen window, their cameras already rolling as reporters adjusted their hair and tested their microphones. Behind them, more cars pulled up. Police cruisers with their lights off, but their presence unmistakable. City officials in dark suits checking their phones and whispering to each other behind cupped hands. "They're going to want to talk to you," Maria said, setting a cup of coffee beside him. Her voice carried no worry, just the calm acceptance of someone who had watched miracles unfold in her backyard all night. Roberto nodded, his eyes never leaving the statue. She sat exactly where they'd placed her hours ago, bathed in morning light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The crowd had grown larger as dawn approached. What started as a handful of neighbors had become something else entirely. Families from across town, elderly people who hadn't left their houses in months, teenagers who should have been sleeping off their weekend parties, all of them drawn by something they couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. His phone vibrated again, the 20th call in 2 hours. This time it was Channel 7 News, the same station that had covered his brother's restaurant opening last year. Roberto let it go to voicemail, just like all the others. How could he explain what he didn't understand himself? How could he tell a reporter that a marble statue had somehow changed the electrical grid of an entire city? Because that's exactly what had happened. The power company had called 3 times, asking if he knew anything about the unusual energy patterns they'd recorded overnight. Streetlights that should have been on timers had synchronized themselves into waves of illumination. Traffic signals had somehow coordinated to create clear paths through intersections. Even the hospital had reported that their backup generators had activated without cause, then shut down precisely when the main power grid stabilized. All starting at 11:53 p.m., exactly 6 minutes after Roberto had first touched the statue on Highway 9. A soft knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. Not the aggressive pounding of reporters or officials, but something gentler. Maria squeezed his shoulder before walking to answer it. Through the doorway, Roberto could hear voices, quiet conversation in Spanish, punctuated by what sounded like tears. Maria returned with an elderly woman Roberto didn't recognize. She moved slowly, supported by a wooden cane that clicked against the hardwood floor. Her hair was silver, pulled back in a bun that reminded Roberto of his grandmother, but it was her eyes that caught his attention. They held the same peaceful expression he'd seen on the statue's face. "This is Mrs. Valdez," Maria said softly. "She lives on the other side of town. She walked here." Roberto stood, offering his chair, but the woman waved him away with a gentle smile. "I came to thank you," she said, her accent thick but her English clear, "for bringing her home." "Home?" Roberto frowned. "I found her on the highway. I don't know where she came from." Mrs. Valdez moved closer to the window, her gaze fixed on the statue. "She belonged to my family for 60 years. My husband carved her himself when we first came to this country. She sat in our garden, watching over our children, our grandchildren." Her voice broke slightly. "When my husband died last month, my son said we had to sell the house. Too expensive to maintain. He took her to an antique shop downtown, said she was worth money." Roberto's chest tightened. "The antique shop sold her?" "No." Mrs. Valdez shook her head, tears flowing freely now. "The owner called yesterday, said she was gone, disappeared from his display window sometime during the night. No broken glass, no sign of forced entry, like she had just vanished." She pressed her hand against the window glass, her fingers trembling. "But I knew she would find her way to someone who understood, someone who would care for her properly." The weight of understanding settled over Roberto like a blanket. The statue hadn't been abandoned on the highway. She had been seeking something, or someone. A family that would treasure her not for her monetary value but for what she represented. Faith, hope, the belief that miracles still existed in a world that had forgotten how to look for them. Outside, the crowd had organized itself into something resembling a festival. Children drew pictures with chalk on the sidewalk, their artwork depicting angels and stars and small marble statues. Teenagers who should have been sleeping in until noon sat cross-legged on the grass, their phones forgotten as they listened to elderly neighbors tell stories about answered prayers and unexpected blessings. Someone had brought a guitar. The soft strumming of familiar hymns drifted through the window, mixing with conversations in both English and Spanish. The barriers that usually divided the neighborhood had dissolved overnight, replaced by something Roberto had never seen before: pure, uncomplicated community. "The mayor's here," Maria announced, peering through the front curtain. "And I think that's Father Martinez from St. Joseph's." Roberto had known this moment would come. Official questions, formal investigations, people in positions of authority who would want logical explanations for illogical events. He straightened his shoulders, kissed Maria's cheek, and walked toward the front door. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of coffee and fresh bread from someone's kitchen. The crowd parted as he stepped onto his porch, creating a respectful path toward the officials waiting on his lawn. But it wasn't the mayor who spoke first. It was Father Martinez, a young priest Roberto remembered from Carlos's wedding years ago. "Roberto," Father Martinez said, extending his hand. "I understand you've had quite a night." "That's one way to put it, Father." The priest smiled, his eyes kind but alert. "I've been fielding calls since 4 a.m., people wanting to know if this is official, if the church has sanctioned what's happening here." He glanced around at the gathering crowd, at the impromptu shrine that had formed in Roberto's backyard. "What would you like me to tell them?" It was a fair question. Roberto looked at the faces surrounding him. Neighbors he'd known for years but had never really talked to. Children whose names he'd never learned. Elderly people who had probably been praying longer than he'd been alive. All of them united by something that defied easy categorization. "Tell them it's real," Roberto said finally. "I can't explain how or why, but it's real, and it's bringing people together in ways I've never seen before." Father Martinez nodded slowly. "That's usually how these things work. God doesn't always operate through official channels." The mayor stepped forward, a thin man in an expensive suit who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the situation. "Mr. Martinez, we need to discuss logistics. Traffic control, safety permits, crowd management. This gathering isn't exactly legal according to city ordinances." "What ordinance covers divine intervention?" Roberto asked, surprising himself with his boldness. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Even the mayor cracked a smile, though he tried to hide it. "Look, I'm not here to shut anything down, but we need to make sure everyone stays safe. If this continues to grow," he gestured at the street, which was now lined with cars from 3 different counties. "It will continue to grow," Mrs. Valdez said, appearing beside Roberto with her cane clicking against the porch boards. "Word is spreading. People are hungry for hope, and hope is exactly what she provides." As if summoned by her words, more cars began arriving. A church bus from 2 towns over, a van full of nursing home residents, their wheelchairs and walkers being carefully unloaded by volunteers. Even a news helicopter circled overhead, its rotors creating a rhythmic percussion that somehow didn't disturb the peaceful atmosphere below. Roberto watched it all unfold with a mixture of wonder and apprehension. This was bigger than his small house, bigger than his quiet neighborhood. The statue had awakened something in people that went far beyond religious devotion. It was about connection, about remembering that miracles didn't have to be grand gestures from heaven. Sometimes they were as simple as a taxi driver stopping to help something that seemed lost. "Father," Roberto said quietly, "what happens next?" The priest considered the question carefully. "That depends on what you want to happen. This is your home, your decision. But I will say this. In 30 years of ministry, I've never seen anything quite like what's happening here. People aren't just observing a miracle, they're participating in one. As the day progressed, the gathering evolved into something unprecedented. Local restaurants began delivering free food. The fire department set up a first aid station. Someone organized a sign-up sheet for people to take turns cleaning up trash and maintaining order. The crowd was managing itself, creating its own systems of care and organization. Roberto found himself moving through the groups, listening to stories that made his chest tight with emotion. A mother whose son had been deployed overseas, who had felt him reach out to her in prayer the moment she saw the statue. A man who had been battling cancer, who claimed his pain had lessened for the first time in months. A teenage girl who had been considering suicide, who now spoke about feeling surrounded by love she couldn't explain. Not everyone believed, of course. Skeptics arrived with cameras and measuring devices, determined to prove that what people were experiencing was nothing more than mass hysteria or clever manipulation. But even the doubters seemed affected by the atmosphere. Roberto watched a cynical journalist from the city paper spend 20 minutes interviewing Mrs. Patterson about her roses, which had somehow bloomed out of season overnight. As evening approached, the crowd showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, it had grown larger and more diverse. Families spread picnic blankets on the grass. Teenagers formed prayer circles. Elderly couples sat in folding chairs, holding hands and watching the statue with expressions of profound peace. Roberto stood on his porch, Maria beside him, surveying the transformation of their quiet street into something resembling a modern-day pilgrimage site. The statue remained exactly where they'd placed her, unchanged and unchanging, but somehow responsible for everything unfolding around her. "Are you okay with this?" Maria asked, slipping her arm through his. Roberto considered the question. 24 hours ago, he had been a tired taxi driver going through the motions of a life he barely recognized. Tonight, he was the custodian of something sacred, the keeper of a miracle that belonged to everyone and no one at the same time. "I think," he said slowly, "this is exactly what's supposed to happen. I just never imagined I'd be the one it happened through." The first star appeared in the darkening sky, followed quickly by others. Someone began singing, a voice clear and strong rising above the gentle murmur of conversation. Other voices joined in, creating a chorus that seemed to lift the entire gathering toward something higher than themselves. Roberto closed his eyes and listened to the harmony of languages and ages, to the sound of his community discovering what it meant to believe in something together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more questions, more people seeking answers he didn't have. But tonight, standing on his porch with his wife's hand in his and a marble statue watching over the most beautiful chaos he'd ever witnessed, Roberto Martinez understood that some questions didn't need answers. They just needed to be lived. The miracle wasn't the statue appearing on the highway. The miracle was what happened when people chose to gather around something bigger than their individual fears and doubts. The miracle was community born from wonder, hope shared among strangers who were no longer strangers. And it was only the beginning. 3 days passed, and the world had taken notice. News vans lined every street for blocks around Roberto's house. Satellite trucks created a mechanical forest of reaching arms, all pointed skyward, transmitting the story to places Roberto had never imagined his name would travel. CNN, Fox News, Univision, even BBC had sent correspondents. The quiet residential street had become an international stage. But it wasn't the media attention that unsettled Roberto. It was the change in the people themselves. What had begun as a spontaneous gathering of neighbors sharing wonder had evolved into something more complex. Tour buses now dropped off pilgrims from distant states. Vendors sold bottled water and plastic rosaries from folding tables. Someone had erected a donation box with a handwritten sign asking for contributions to maintain the shrine. Roberto sat in his kitchen, watching through the window as strangers trampled Maria's marigolds while positioning themselves for better photographs. The statue remained serene, untouched by the chaos swirling around her, but something pure had been lost in the translation from miracle to spectacle. A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. Maria opened the door to reveal Dr. Sarah Chen, a woman in her 40s carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of confident expression that belonged to someone accustomed to solving problems others couldn't. "Mr. Martinez? I'm Dr. Chen from the university's Department of Religious Studies. I was hoping we could talk." Roberto gestured to the chair across from him. Dr. Chen settled herself with practiced efficiency, pulling out a tablet and a small recording device. "I've been following the events here for the past 72 hours. Fascinating case study in modern miraculous phenomena." "Case study?" Roberto's voice carried an edge he hadn't intended. "Please don't misunderstand. I'm not here to debunk anything. Quite the opposite, actually. I study the intersection between faith and community, how shared beliefs create social transformation. What's happening here is remarkable, but it's also fragile." Through the window, Roberto could see a group of teenagers taking selfies with the statue, their laughter cutting through the murmur of prayers from other visitors. A man in an expensive suit was interviewing Mrs. Valdez, his camera crew capturing her tears as she spoke about her late husband's craftsmanship. "It's changing," Roberto said quietly. "This isn't what it was supposed to be." Dr. Chen nodded. "That's exactly why I'm here. I've seen this pattern before. Sacred experiences that begin organically often struggle to maintain their authenticity as they grow. The challenge is preserving the essence while managing the reality of public attention. What do you suggest? Structure without bureaucracy, guidelines that protect the experience while allowing it to continue evolving naturally." She pulled up something on her tablet. "There's a monastery in New Mexico that faced a similar situation 20 years ago. They developed what they called sacred space protocols, simple rules that preserved the spiritual atmosphere while accommodating visitors." Roberto looked at Maria, who had been listening from the doorway. She moved to stand beside his chair, her hand resting on his shoulder. "What kind of rules? Quiet hours? Designated prayer areas? Limits on commercial activity? Most importantly, regular times when the space is reserved exclusively for local community members." Dr. Chen leaned forward. "The goal isn't to exclude anyone, but to ensure that the original spirit of what happened here doesn't get lost in the noise." Outside, a heated argument had erupted between two rival religious groups, each claiming their interpretation of the miracle was correct. Their raised voices clashed with the gentle hymns being sung by a choir from the Methodist church across town. The contradiction made Roberto's chest tight with frustration. "How do we even begin?" he asked. "With the people who were here first. Your neighbors, Mrs. Valdez, Father Martinez, the ones who understood what was happening before it became a headline." Dr. Chen closed her tablet. "They're your foundation. Build from there." That evening, after the last tour bus had departed and the news crews had retreated to their hotels, Roberto called an impromptu meeting. He stood on his porch, addressing the 24 people who had stayed behind. These were the faces he recognized, the voices that had joined in prayer that first miraculous night. "We need to talk," he began, his words carrying across the suddenly quiet yard, "about what this has become and what we want it to be." Mrs. Patterson spoke first. "It's getting out of hand, Roberto. I can barely get to my own mailbox without someone asking me to pose for a picture. The parking is terrible," added Jim, from down the street. "My wife couldn't get to her doctor's appointment yesterday because the streets were blocked." But Mrs. Valdez raised her weathered hand, her voice cutting through the complaints. "The crowds will come whether we want them or not. The question is whether we guide what happens, or let others decide for us." Father Martinez stepped forward. "Mrs. Valdez is right. This isn't going away. But it doesn't have to become a circus either." He looked around at the assembled neighbors. "We have a choice. We can retreat and let outsiders define what happened here, or we can take responsibility for protecting it." Roberto felt the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders. He hadn't asked for this role, hadn't wanted to become the guardian of something so much bigger than himself, But looking at the faces surrounding him, he realized that choice had been made the moment he stopped his taxi on that foggy highway. "Dr. Chen thinks we need guidelines," he said. "Ways to keep this sacred while still allowing people to experience what we experienced." "What kind of guidelines?" asked Maria. Roberto pulled out a piece of paper where he'd been scribbling notes. Quiet hours from sunrise to 9 a.m., and again from 6 to sunset. Time for prayer without cameras or interviews. No commercial sales on the property itself. And every Sunday evening, just for our neighborhood, just for us. The group discussed details late into the night. How to manage parking, where to place portable restrooms, whether to allow organized tours. Each decision felt monumental, as if they were creating the blueprint for something unprecedented. By midnight, they had reached consensus. Simple rules designed to preserve the spirit of that first extraordinary night while acknowledging the reality of continued public interest. Mrs. Valdez volunteered to coordinate with local churches to provide volunteer guides. Father Martinez offered to work with the city on traffic management. Even the teenagers from the first night agreed to help with cleanup and crowd control. The next morning brought a new challenge. Roberto woke to find a man in an expensive suit standing in his backyard, measuring the area around the statue with a laser device. Behind him, two other men in hard hats discussed something with animated gestures. "Excuse me," Roberto called out, stepping through his back door. "What's going on here?" The man in the suit extended a business card. "Marcus Webb, Webb Development Corporation. I represent a group of investors interested in developing this site properly. Shrine facilities, visitor center, gift shop, parking structure. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for your property." Roberto stared at the card without taking it. "It's not for sale. Mr. Martinez, be reasonable. This is bigger than your little house now. People are coming from all over the world. They deserve proper facilities, professional management. We're talking about a multi-million-dollar religious tourism destination. Based on what? A statue in my kitchen window?" Marcus Webb smiled with practiced patience. "Based on documented miraculous phenomena, electrical anomalies, reported healings, synchronized prayer responses across multiple demographics. This site has measurable spiritual significance." The clinical language made Roberto's stomach turn. Webb was describing the most sacred experience of his life like a business proposal, reducing wonder to profit margins and spiritual awakening to tourism revenue. "Get off my property," Roberto said quietly. "Mr. Martinez, you're missing an incredible opportunity here. The Vatican is sending investigators next week. CNN is planning a documentary. This could be the next Lourdes, and you could be set for life." I said, "Get off my property." Webb's smile faltered. "You can't stop progress, Mr. Martinez. If you won't work with us, we'll work around you. There are zoning changes we can pursue, eminent domain procedures. This is too important to be left in the hands of one stubborn taxi driver." Roberto stepped closer, his voice dropping to a level that carried more threat than any shout could have. "The statue stays where she is. My house stays where it is. And you stay away from both." After Webb and his team left, Roberto sat heavily in his kitchen chair. The statue looked exactly as she had that first night, serene and untouchable, but Roberto felt the walls of his simple life crumbling around him. Forces beyond his control were converging on this quiet miracle, each with their own agenda. Maria brought him coffee and sat beside him in companionable silence. Outside, the morning pilgrims were beginning to arrive, their voices blending in familiar prayers. Children drew chalk angels on the sidewalk while their parents stood in respectful contemplation. It was beautiful and overwhelming and terrifying all at once. "What have we gotten ourselves into?" Roberto whispered. "Something bigger than us," Maria replied. "But that doesn't mean we're powerless. We just have to remember why she came to you in the first place." Roberto looked at the statue, her marble face unchanged by all the chaos swirling around her. She had chosen him somehow. A tired taxi driver who had stopped believing in miracles until one literally stood in his headlights. Not a priest or a prophet or a perfect person, but someone willing to stop and help when help was needed. Maybe that was enough. Maybe being ordinary was exactly the qualification required to guard something extraordinary. His phone buzzed with another call from another reporter, another offer from another developer, another request from another person who wanted to package and sell what had happened here. Roberto turned the phone off and poured himself more coffee. Outside, Mrs. Valdez was telling a young mother about her husband's hands, how they had shaped marble into prayer. Father Martinez was leading a small group in the rosary, his voice steady and sure. Jim, from down the street, was helping an elderly man find a comfortable place to sit. This was what mattered. Not the cameras or the contracts or the critics, just people finding hope in each other's presence, gathering around something that reminded them miracles were still possible in a world that had forgotten how to believe. Roberto stood up, squared his shoulders, and walked outside to join them. Whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. The statue had brought them together, but it was their choice to stay together. And that choice, Roberto realized, might be the most miraculous thing of all. The investigation team from Rome arrived on a Tuesday. 3 men in dark suits who spoke in hushed tones and carried leather portfolios filled with official documents. They set up their equipment with clinical precision, transforming Roberto's backyard into something resembling a scientific laboratory. Cameras to record any unusual phenomena, electromagnetic field detectors, even a device that measured atmospheric pressure changes. Roberto watched from his kitchen window as they worked, their movements efficient and impersonal. These men had investigated hundreds of reported miracles around the world. They knew how to separate genuine supernatural events from mass hysteria, religious fraud, or simple coincidence. Father Martinez served as their liaison, translating between the Vatican investigators and the local community. Roberto could see him gesturing toward the statue, explaining the timeline of events, the documented electrical anomalies, the testimonies of healing and transformation. "They're thorough," Maria observed, joining Roberto at the window. "That one has been measuring the same spot for 20 minutes. They have to be. The church doesn't officially recognize miracles lightly." Roberto sipped his coffee, watching as one of the investigators carefully photographed the statue from every angle. Too many false claims. Too many people trying to manufacture holiness for profit. As if summoned by his words, Marcus Webb appeared again, this time with a larger entourage. City councilmen, media representatives, and what looked like a team of lawyers. They set up their own informal meeting near the street, clearly positioning themselves to observe the Vatican investigation. Roberto's phone rang. The caller ID showed Father Martinez. "Roberto, could you come outside for a moment? The investigators would like to speak with you." The lead investigator was a thin man with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed to see everything without judging anything. He introduced himself as Monseigneur Delacroix, his English accented with French precision. "Mr. Martinez, we understand you were the first to encounter the statue. Could you walk us through exactly what happened that night?" Roberto told the story again, the details now polished smooth from repetition. The fog, the figure by the roadside, the moment of recognition, the decision to stop and help. Monseigneur Delacroix listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a leather journal. "And the electrical phenomena began immediately after you touched the statue, within minutes. The streetlights, the traffic signals, everything started changing patterns." Roberto gestured toward the city visible in the distance. "The power company has documentation. It's all on record. We've seen those records. Most unusual." The Monsignor moved closer to the statue, his gaze studying her carved features. "Tell me, Mr. Martinez, what do you believe happened that night?" It was the question Roberto had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. How do you explain the unexplainable to someone whose job is to verify miracles? "I think," Roberto said carefully, "that she was lost and needed help. And I think helping her changed everything, not just for me but for everyone who came after." "You speak of her as if she were alive." Roberto met the investigator's eyes, Aren't all expressions of faith alive in some way? When people pray to her, when they find comfort in her presence, when they change their lives because of what she represents, isn't that a form of life? Monsignor Delacroix smiled, the first expression of warmth Roberto had seen from him. That's a very sophisticated theological answer from a taxi driver. Maybe taxi drivers see more of life than most people realize. The investigation continued for 3 days. The team interviewed dozens of witnesses, documented testimonies of healing and spiritual awakening, measured environmental changes that couldn't be explained by conventional science. They were professional, respectful, and maddeningly non-committal about their findings. On the final day, Monsignor Delacroix requested a private meeting with Roberto. They sat in the living room, the statue visible through the kitchen doorway, afternoon light making her marble skin seem to glow. "Our investigation is complete," the Monsignor said. "I want you to understand, regardless of our official findings, something extraordinary has happened here. People's lives have been changed. A community has been transformed. Faith has been renewed in ways that are measurable and profound." But Roberto sensed hesitation in the man's voice. But the church moves slowly, carefully. Official recognition of miraculous phenomena requires extensive review, multiple levels of approval, years of continued observation. He leaned forward. "What I'm saying is, don't wait for our blessing to continue what you've started here." Roberto felt a mixture of disappointment and relief. Part of him had hoped for official validation, the kind of recognition that would silence the skeptics and legitimize the experience. But another part understood that some truths didn't require institutional approval. What happens now? Now you continue being the guardian of something sacred. You protect it from those who would exploit it, nurture it for those who need it, and trust that its significance doesn't depend on documents from Rome. After the investigators left, the media attention intensified rather than diminished. The Vatican's non-committal statement had only fueled more speculation. Roberto found himself fielding calls from talk show producers, documentary filmmakers, and book publishers. Everyone wanted to tell his story, usually for a price. Marcus Webb made one final attempt, arriving with contracts and architectural plans for a religious theme park that would dwarf anything previously built around a miraculous site. "Last chance, Mr. Martinez. After this, the offers stop coming." Roberto looked at the glossy renderings of gift shops and parking structures, at the proposed shrine that looked more like a shopping mall than a sacred space. "Good," he said, handing the plans back untouched. "I never wanted your offers in the first place." As autumn settled over the city, the crowds began to change character. The sensation seekers and curiosity tourists moved on to newer spectacles. What remained were the pilgrims, the seekers, the people who came not for excitement, but for peace. They arrived quietly, prayed silently, and left transformed in ways that couldn't be measured by Vatican instruments or media cameras. Roberto established a routine that honored both the sacred nature of what was happening and the practical needs of his family. Morning prayers in multiple languages, afternoon visiting hours with volunteer guides from the community, evening quiet time when the statue belonged only to the neighborhood again. Mrs. Valdez had become the unofficial historian of the site, sharing stories about her husband's craftsmanship and the statue's original purpose as a guardian of family and home. Her presence lent authenticity to the experience, connecting the current miracle to a longer tradition of faith and devotion. Children drew pictures of angels and left them near the statue. Elderly visitors shared stories of answered prayers and unexpected blessings. Young couples asked for intercession in their relationships. The sick came seeking healing. And while Roberto couldn't promise miraculous cures, he witnessed something equally powerful: people finding strength in shared hope. One evening, as Roberto was locking up after the last visitors had left, he noticed something different about the statue. Not a dramatic change, but something subtle in the way the fading light caught her features. She looked, for just a moment, like she was smiling. Roberto blinked, and the expression was gone, replaced by her familiar serenity. But the impression lingered, a sense that she approved of what had grown around her. Not the crowds or the attention or the documentation, but the simple human connections that happened in her presence. That night, Roberto dreamed of the highway again. The fog, the lonely figure by the roadside, the moment of decision that had changed everything. But in the dream, he wasn't alone in his taxi. The back seat was filled with all the people who had found their way to his house, all the lives that had been touched by one simple act of kindness. He woke with the understanding that the miracle wasn't really about the statue at all. It was about what happened when people chose to stop, to help, to believe in something bigger than their individual fears and doubts. The statue had been the catalyst, but the real transformation lived in the hearts of everyone who had gathered around her. And that transformation would continue long after the news cameras left, long after the investigations concluded, long after the world moved on to newer mysteries. Because some miracles don't depend on official recognition or scientific validation. They depend on ordinary people making extraordinary choices, one small act of faith at a time. Roberto smiled and reached for Maria's hand. Outside, the statue kept her eternal vigil, watching over a community that had learned to believe in miracles again. And in the distance, the city lights pulsed in their mysterious rhythm, a reminder that some changes, once begun, never really end. Sometimes the most extraordinary miracles begin with the simplest choices. Roberto Martinez thought he was just helping a lost statue find shelter from the cold. He had no idea he was about to become the guardian of something that would transform an entire community. What started as one man's act of kindness on a foggy highway became a beacon of hope for thousands. The statue didn't just find a home in Roberto's kitchen window. She found her way into the hearts of everyone who witnessed what happened when ordinary people choose to believe in something greater than themselves. The investigators came and went. The crowds eventually thinned. The media moved on to newer stories. But the real miracle endures in the lives that were changed, the community that was born, the faith that was rekindled in the most unexpected place. Roberto still drives his taxi through the city streets, but now he sees them differently. Every passenger carries their own story of hope or heartbreak. Every street corner holds the possibility of an encounter that could change everything. He learned that miracles don't always announce themselves with thunder and lightning. Sometimes they appear as quietly as a marble statue standing by the roadside, waiting for someone to stop and care. Because the truth is, we all have the power to be Roberto Martinez. We all have moments when we can choose to stop, to help, to believe. And when we do, we discover that the highway of life is never really empty. It's full of sacred encounters waiting to unfold, one small miracle at a time.